All right, so today we're really diving into a fascinating topic, the Joe Rogan Experience and how this whole podcasting empire he's built, how it really exploded.
Yeah, and you're right. To call it an empire, it's more than just a podcast at this point. It's like he's tapped into something huge culturally.
Definitely. And it's funny you mentioned that. It's like the timing of this is perfect because I've been on this Rogan kick myself lately. Like, what is it about his approach that just pulls people in?
Yeah.
And thankfully, we've got a ton of info here mapping out his whole journey, even before the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And this is where it gets interesting, right? We're talking stand-up comedy, that whole world, news radio, even remember Fear Factor. It's like he was made for being in front of an audience, even with all the chaos those gigs probably involved.
And that's what I find so fascinating about his story is like you could almost draw a line from those early days to the podcasting giant he is now.
Totally.
Think about the kind of skills you hone doing stand-up, right?
Mm-hmm.
That raw honesty, that ability to connect with people in a way that's, I don't know, just real.
And immediate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Fear Factor. Talk about pushing boundaries, embracing the uncomfortable.
No kidding.
It's like those experiences were almost like boot camp for the kind of no-holds-barred approach he brings to the podcast.
I've never thought about it like that, but you're totally right. It's like he was already comfortable with being himself, putting himself out there, even when it meant taking risks,
Yeah.
which is what makes his jump to podcasting so fascinating to me. I mean, 2009 rolls around and boom, the podcast is born. But the stuff you sent over, it sounds like it wasn't some big calculated move.
No, not at all. It really was born out of this genuine curiosity, this desire to just explore interesting ideas and have these conversations that felt raw and authentic.
Yeah.
And it's funny, back then, it wasn't about fancy studios or production value or any of that. It was just Rogan, a microphone, and this drive to have real, unscripted dialogues with people.
And that's what's so wild, right? Because it just blew up. It wasn't some calculated media strategy. It was something way more organic, way more genuine.
Right.
And that's what we're going to unpack today. And this is where I find his format so fascinating. Like the text we're looking at today, it describes the podcast as, and I'm quoting here, relaxed but intellectually stimulating, which honestly, those two things feel like they shouldn't go together, but somehow Rogan makes it work.
Totally. It's like he's walking this tightrope.
Yeah.
And he just never falls off.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's totally intentional on his part. I mean, the length of those episodes alone, right? They're these sprawling marathon conversations. And he's got this crazy mix of guests.
Oh, yeah.
1 minute, you've got Elon Musk talking space travel. The next, it's, well, let's just say Rogan's not afraid to stir up a little controversy with some of his other guests.
Oh, for sure. He's got a wide range, and that's part of his whole thing, right? But it's interesting you mentioned that Elon Musk episode, because it makes me think about, like, where the line is,
Totally.
Because that whole thing, smoking weed on air with the CEO of Tesla, like, that's peak Joe Rogan right there.
Yeah.
And, of course, it goes completely viral, which just proves his instincts are dead on,
100%. And I think that's a perfect illustration of what sets Rogan apart, right? It's like he's tapped into this hunger for something authentic, even if it gets a little messy sometimes.
Yeah, yeah.
He's not afraid to let the conversation go where it goes, and I think that really resonates with people, especially now when everything feels so curated and polished online.
It's so true. It's like you're just hanging out with him, having this conversation, except the other person in the conversation happens to be, revolutionizing the way we think about space exploration or whatever.
Exactly. He's such a pro at bridging that gap. You know?
Total.
Even when he's talking to these people who are at the top of their fields, leading thinkers, he still manages to position himself as this kind of co-learner, asking the questions that his audience wants to know the answers to, but maybe wouldn't even know how to ask.
It's so refreshing, especially when you compare it to how traditional media operates, always shying away from the tough conversations, trying to smooth everything over. Rogan goes there, He leans right into the tough questions, doesn't shy away from a little controversy, and honestly, that's a breath of fresh air for a lot of people. But speaking of shaking things up, we got to talk about the elephant in the room, the thing that completely changed the game, his deal with Spotify.
Oh, yeah, no doubt about it. That was a turning point, not just for Rogan, but for the whole podcasting world, really.
For real, 2020 rolls around and boom, this massive exclusive deal drops. Rogan and Spotify, a match made in, well, somewhere. And the number everyone's throwing around, $100 million. It's like podcasting went from 0 to 100 overnight.
It definitely legitimized the whole industry in a way we hadn't seen before.
Hmm.
Suddenly everyone's paying attention, investors, advertisers, the whole nine yards.
And you got to think about the position that put Rogan in. Easy to just take the money, right, and let Spotify call the shots. But here's the thing he didn't. He kept complete creative control, which, when you think about it, is huge.
Yeah, practically unheard of with that kind of money on the line. It says a lot about him, how committed he is to his vision, to his audience. He wasn't about to compromise the heart of what made the podcast work in the first place.
And for me, that decision speaks volumes. It's just as important as the Spotify deal itself. It's like he solidified that image, that he's an independent voice, He's not beholden to anyone.
And people pick up on that, right? All comes back to authenticity. In a world full of influencers and algorithms, Rogan's this reminder that you can't fake genuine connection.
It really makes you think. The stuff we've been looking at today, it paints Rogan as this phenomenon, and he is. But what's really inspiring is that it's not about some fancy studio or marketing budget. It's about that genuine curiosity, those raw conversations, the freedom to just explore. And honestly, I think that's something we could all use a little more of in our lives, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Maybe it's time we all embraced a bit of that Rogan spirit. Dive into the unknown, get a little uncomfortable, and see what we discover. You never know what you might find.